So I want to just say a little bit about the journal Historical Research, from which this lecture is named. Historical research has always had a particular commitment to active community building. Early issues of historical research, which at that time was known as the Bulletin of the Institute of Historical Research, consistently highlighted the variety of historical research and the multiple places where historical research could take place. The early bulletin of the Institute of Historical Research was it was a publication that celebrated diversity of history making, rather than trying to corral it within a university environment. And I think this is very much in keeping with the theme of tonight's lecture. For the IHR's founder, Professor A.F. Pollard, the journal was essentially the literary manifestation of the IHR as a historical laboratory. And so I think it's entirely fitting that the theme of tonight's lecture, the idea of whether popular history can be radical, and that sense of what history is for, and the different ways in which we might do history and experiment with the telling of stories about the past, think creatively, think experimentally about how to tell those stories to new and wider audiences, is again very much in keeping with the founding sentiment of Pollard and his sense of what the IHR should be about. From its very beginnings, the IHR's journal has also placed early career research right at its core. The Institute was established in part to support students to make their work visible. The very first issue of the bulletin showcased the work of two MA students at the time in 1923. There was also an article on the value of the seminar for historical training. So that sense of really supporting and nurturing the next generation of historical researcher. So today we continue this tradition of being a particularly welcoming place for those in the earlier stages of their career to publish, to get their first step out there in the world in many cases. In fact, the journal continues to thrive in no little part because of the quality of the work that our history community submits for consideration. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But at this point, I just want to take a little pause to thank our editor, Dr. Sarah Charles, who has guided the journal through some quite choppy waters of COVID and post-COVID to its current really vibrant state. So thank you, Sarah. And that she did this whilst also publishing over the last year an incredibly successful popular history of her own, the medieval scriptorium, adds another lovely kind of layer of serendipity to the theme of tonight's lecture. Our support for those at the beginning stages of their careers in history is particularly manifest in the annual Pollard Prize, which is presented to the best paper that itself was presented at an IHR seminar by a postgraduate student or by a researcher within a year of their PhD submission. And like this event, the prize is supported by Oxford University Press, to whom we are very grateful. This year, we're celebrating two entries, the winner and the runner-up. Both get prizes. So I want to mention the runner-up first. This year's runner-up to the prize is Niall Gray for a paper called The Burns Connection, the Scotland USSR Society and Cold War Cultural Diplomacy. And Niall will be receiving £200 of OUP books and fast-track publication in historical research. Now, in true Oscars tradition, Niall cannot be with us tonight and will not be joining us via link because they were teaching in Glasgow today, as people in the earlier stages and later stages of the careers do tend to do. But we congratulate Niall. But our winner of this year's Pollard Prize is Berry Pilot de Chenezay for No Place to Be a Child, the persistence and peculiarities of children's play during the Second World War in London and Liverpool. Berry receives £500 in books and fast track publication, and I'm delighted that Berry is able to join us tonight. So Berry, can I ask you, if it's not too embarrassing, to come up to the front? We have a gift for you. And I'm certainly looking forward to seeing your article in print. Very well done. So to tonight's speaker. Catherine Clarke is Professor and Director of the IHR's Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. She's also Director of the Victoria County History of England and is a cultural historian specialising in the Middle Ages, who has published extensively in this area and very many others. Catherine, I think, is the most probably the most committed to collaborative work person I've ever met. I mean, your delight in collaboration and your commitment to the possibilities of doing history together are just not only brilliant in a workplace, but also sometimes actively moving, because it's a demonstration that what we do together as historians really matters. Catherine is also very committed to building public engagement with history. Her book for Penguin, which was published only in September, but it feels like it's been out forever, in a good way. It has received great acclaim. Some of you may have read it already. I mean, certainly my mum will be, because I've got it as a Christmas present. And some of you may have heard its serialisation for Radio 4's Book of the Week. And if you haven't listened to that, please do listen to it, because it's just lovely. It's a really lovely thing to listen to. So I'll stop talking now, because I've taken up enough space, but I want to welcome Catherine to deliver the 2025 Historical Research Lecture.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Claire, for that introduction, which risked making me feel too emotional just before giving my lecture. It's such an honour and a privilege to be asked to give a lecture that's a real landmark in the IHR annual calendar, the Historical Research Lecture. So it's a real delight to be speaking this evening. So I thought we'd get the answer out of the way first. Can popular history be radical? Yes, of course it can. But I'm afraid it's not quite time to go home yet. In today's lecture, I want to explore how popular history is radical. I'm interested in what radical popular history can do and why it's important. I do realise that from the start, I'm going to need to say a little bit about the terms I'm using, though I don't want us to get bogged down in definitions and semantics for the next 45 minutes. By popular history, I'm thinking primarily about trade history, non-fiction books published for a wide audience beyond the academy, the kind of books you might see on the shelves in your local Waterstones. And I think we could argue that we're living through something of a golden age for popular history. History books, along with history TV, online content, and podcasts, are enjoyed by enormous audiences. Skeptics point to limitations. A frequent accusation levelled at popular history in the UK is that it's endless Tudors and Nazis. But popular history can be transformative. US historian Scott Spillman, writing for the American magazine The Point, argues that popular history can offer a broader interpretation of the world, a new perspective on the past that also leads to a new understanding of the present, something that is accessible to a reasonably broad public and offers at least the potential to rearrange a reader's mental furniture. In this lecture, I'll point to various examples of popular history, and in particular, I will draw on the experience of writing my own new book aimed at a wide audience and published by Penguin Allen Lane. Not because I want to make grand claims for the book, but because in writing it, I was thinking very consciously about how we bring history and historical practice into the popular imagination and into public conversation in productive ways. So what is radical history? I mean, we could spend all evening talking about this, couldn't we? Of course, I turned first of all for this lecture to History Workshop Journal and History Workshop Online for definitions and examples. History from below, from outside. Historical practice which disrupts and challenges, which attends to neglected, deprivileged and silenced histories, which experiments with form and voice rather than always reproducing conventional scholarly modes of authority, which is shaped by an ethics of production, often involving collaboration and co-creation and expertise from outside the academy. What constitutes radical history isn't static, it changes, because the radical history we need changes. And radical history can be, and often is, done quietly, not always signposted as such. And I'm thinking here of the Victoria County History of England project, which it's my privilege to direct as part of my role here in the IHR. Founded in 1899 and dedicated to Queen Victoria, which is how it gets its name, the VCH aims to write the history of every place in England from the very earliest times to the present day. Now, it certainly wasn't conceived as a radical history project, but today, the VCH is doing quietly radical work across 23 counties and 2 ridings of Yorkshire, working in local communities and powered by volunteers. And it's great to see some VCH colleagues here today. Recently, my IHR colleague Ruth Slatter published an article reimagining the VCH as participatory historical geography, identifying how its model of co-creation, locally defined research agendas, socially engaged research, and yes, political dimensions can offer inclusive and sometimes disruptive approaches to making place-based history. It really is history from the ground up, from the grassroots up. As director of the VCH, I spend a lot of my life as a historian in search of England, something that formed a motivation and an underpinning for my book. So let's note, first of all, that not all radical history is radical in the same way. Today, I want to explore some of the dynamics of radical popular history, moving towards what I'm going to call a manifesto for how research-led, scholarship-driven popular history can and does make necessary, vital interventions in our public life today. So where is the radical in trade history right now? We don't have to look far for examples. Published the very same day as my own book, Miranda Kaufman's Heiresses, exploring the roles of Georgian women in the history of enslavement. Closer to home, and I'm going to embarrass some colleagues, I'm sure now. First of all, Claire Langhammer's book, Class of 37, co-written with Hester Barron, draws on the mass observation archive, but also rethinks and critiques its principles, centering the voices and experiences of 11-year-old girls in their Bolton Elementary School and homes. The Medieval Scriptorium, by Dr. Sarah Charles, editor of Historical Research, is a superb account of medieval book production across many different contexts, but it is radical too, in the way that it begins each chapter with a creative vignette. It's interweaving research and imagination, bringing into being the often invisible hands of a scribe, reader, or artisan, really animating, fully realized three-dimensional existence for those often forgotten figures. Of course, there are plenty of trade books out there which don't set out to be radical. What they offer is sometimes described as escapism or comfort, but I think history always does something more than that, as I'll argue later. So I am new to this game. Others in this room have more experience than me, I'm quite sure. This was my first trade book, a new experience and process, which prompted new thinking about doing popular history, the opportunities, responsibilities, and how it can speak back to what we do in the academy too. So A History of England in 25 Poems does what it says on the tin. It tells the history of England through 25 poems written between the 8th century and today. Each chapter begins with a poem which serves as a kind of portal or time machine, transporting us into a moment in the past. The poem Queen Victoria read after the death of Albert, which tries to make sense of new scientific knowledge alongside religious faith and consolation. Guerrilla poetry, written in English after 1066, holding William the Conqueror to account. Verse which takes us below stairs in an 18th century country house, penned by a housemaid who was dismissed for scribbling when she should have been turning the spit. Summer birdsong at a deserted railway station and the ghosts of the Great War. The wheels of Victorian industry and a tragedy in a coal mine. Voices from inside a medieval pandemic and the lived experience of the Black Death. A box of matches and the 1984-5 miners' strike. Each poem opens a doorway into the past, revealing England's history in new and often surprising ways. And of course, straight away, portals, time machines. I'm dealing with language which isn't normally the vocabulary of an academic history paper or monograph. But those metaphors, in fact, emerged directly out of archival research, a real-life wormhole that I encountered in a book in Senate House Library during my reading, which got me thinking about wormholes in the science fiction sense, the way that a book is always a kind of wormhole that can instantly transport us somewhere else in space and time, and the way poems, I think, have a particular power and magic to make that direct, immediate connection with elsewhere, with another moment, with another life. So let me share some examples from the book and where they take us. The poem Pearl, written in the Northwest Midlands around 1390, takes us inside the world of the Black Death. It's a historical context we're all familiar with, a medieval global pandemic which reached England in summer 1348, between 40 and 60% of the population dead. That was just the first wave. Peaks of infection and mortality continued throughout the following decades and beyond. How do we make sense of those huge numbers and sweeping, horrifying statements? How did it actually feel to live through and survive the Black Death? Those of us who've lived through the COVID-19 pandemic know all too well that figures and statistics don't tell the full story or count the true human cost. Poetry, I think, offers an alternative way into the familiar history, a direct, intimate encounter with the emotion and anguish of lived experience. In Pearl, a father, racked by grief, mourns for his young daughter in an idyllic garden haunted by reminders of plague and disease. A jeweler grieves for the beautiful pearl which slipped through his fingers, the most perfect treasure he ever held, now lost and buried. The poem takes that metaphor of an exquisite pearl for a young girl who has died in early childhood. Her father, symbolically the jeweler, who has lost his dearest and most precious gem, falls asleep and meets with a strange dream, the Pearl Maiden, now grown up, in a strange and beautiful otherworld, speaking to him about a marvelous kingdom beyond death. Pearl has left us with a raft of unanswered questions. Who wrote the poem? Who was it for? Was there a real life Pearl Maiden, a young girl who had died? And who was it who mourned her? And given its late 14th century context, did the Pearl Maiden die of the plague? We can't know for certain. But the poem returns compulsively, repeatedly, to images which suggest the horror of the Black Death. And the poem also speaks with acute, undimmed power of the grief of a parent for a lost child. It invites a kind of radical empathy, to use a phrase popularized by US political scientist Terry Givens, which bridges experiences and cultural contexts. Givens proposes radical empathy as a kind of challenging, courageous, imaginative commitment, which can do work amid the social and moral challenges of racism, division, political rupture, and conflict. The dreamer laments that his lost Pearl child lived not 2 years in our world. His anguish is palpable as he is torn from memories of the girl's beauty to the thought of her cherished body buried in the earth, to think of her colour so clothed in clod. He speaks of the agony and joy bound together as he remembers his daughter, confides in us the heartbreaking truth that no song ever seemed to me so sweet as the silent moments when her memory stole up on me. Perhaps, so far, you might be thinking there's no really radical empathy involved in relating to the grief of a bereaved father. But other aspects of the poem and the historical context are more challenging. The dreamer experiences and articulates his emotions in ways which are sometimes alien and strange to us today. Feelings don't remain static and unchanged across history. The dreamer tells us that my breast burns and swells with sorrow. Mi breste inbalabut bolna and bele. The notion of his heart burning and swelling recalls early English ideas about the mind and how it functioned physically, physiologically within the body. He also speaks of the pain of love longing, literally louve danger or love danger, a term borrowed from the courtly romance tradition of forbidden passion, knightly devotion and courtship. It's suggesting the agony of a love that can't be requited, but also for us as modern readers, makes strange use of an erotic concept to articulate a parent's grief. The past can be difficult to reach, even through the portal of a poem. In what way, then, could it be radical to empathise with a bereaved father in 14th century England? Terry Givens' model of radical empathy doesn't end with feeling, but requires an appropriate response or action. Compassion as a prompt towards active engagement, practical action, and work for social justice. I end my chapter on Pearl with a gesture towards what entering into that radical empathy might imply or demand. Just occasionally, you might hear someone suggest that in times of high infant mortality, people loved their children less. That's a catastrophic failure of empathy and imagination, with profound implications for the present day as well as the past. Pearl lets us listen in on an old, faraway grief, as raw and affecting now as ever. It transforms unfathomable statistics of medieval disease and death into just one devastating loss and shares with us the human story. It calls for our compassion and sympathy, even across the centuries. The Black Death is definitely history, right? Big historical story, familiar from school, from textbooks, countless works of scholarly and trade history. But what is history? What's a historical event? Writing my book, I had to choose 25 poems, and I also had to pick historical moments. What landmarks and texts to include in my selection? Not all my poems represent big timeline milestones. And one of my core aims was to include diverse voices, men and women, different social classes, voices of colour, even a poem written by a child. Following my chosen poems moves us beyond a great men and battles version of history, bringing into focus more varied histories and voices, individual life records, small stories, emotional intimacies, and marginalised lives bound up with momentous national events and historical milestones. That poem written by a child, it's Rules and Regulations, written by Lewis Carroll long before he was the famous author of Alice in Wonderland, when he was still little Charles Dodgson, aged just 13. He wrote the poem to entertain his younger siblings, and it's a brilliant, hilarious spoof of the maxims and mnemonics of the Victorian schoolroom. This isn't how it's set out in the book. This is my bodge job on a PowerPoint slide. From take care of a candle, shut a door by the handle, to the rather more absurd and nonsensical refuse cold mutton and starve your canaries, be rude to strangers. I mean, I love the way that whole first column, all of those lines end with the same rhyme. It's obviously having fun with those kind of hooky rhymes in mnemonic verse for the Victorian schoolchild. Seemingly, this isn't a poem about history at all, in the sense of great events and milestones, and it's certainly not a great canonical poem enshrined in the lists of the finest English literature. In my book, I'm clear that this poem is in my selection instead of Rudyard Kipling's If, which regularly does top those surveys of the nation's favourite poems. Instead of Kipling's master dispensing lessons, "You'll be a man, my son," we have the authentic voice of a child at the receiving end of education and discipline. Stiff upper lip, English fair play, pluck and grit. Young Charles Dodgson's poem gives us an alternative way into a model of Englishness forged through the 19th century. It points us towards doctrines of ruling class masculinity and training for the future leaders of empire, Victorian values viewed through the carnival mirror of wit and whimsy. It leads us, I propose, from the nursery and the playing fields of public school to the trenches of Ypres and the Somme. Charles Dodgson's comic nonsense poem is its own kind of act of resistance. My book is not an anthology of England's best 25 poems. So just yesterday, I discovered the listing for the US edition of my book online. It was nice to find that. And it describes the poems as 25 of the most vital, magisterial poems in English. And that is sometimes the case. There are some cherished poems in the book and some words to treasure, but other poems in my selection are not exquisite, timeless verse. And of course, that makes them no less fascinating and valuable as ways into history. Bum fodder. The clue's probably in the title that this is not an exquisite, timeless work of literature. First published as a broadside ballad in 1660, this poem is a royalist satire on the Rump Parliament at the tail end of England's Republican experiment. It fully leans in to the scatological associations of the Rump with 21 stanzas of bum, poo, and fart jokes. To give you a flavour, the Rump Parliament is all arse and no body. It's so useless that it's all beshit, you get the idea. And it's probably the only poem you'll ever read, I'll take that bet, that rhymes Magna Carta with Magna Farta. It's actually, of course, playing with body politic imagery in really clever ways, but this is poetry of the street, topical and disposable. In early modern London, with a penny in your purse, you could buy a beer, a loaf of bread, or a broadside ballad sheet. Millions of these broadsides were printed, but today only around 10,000 sheets survive. Many of those broadside rags were read, then put to good use in the privies of early modern London. The poem's full title lets us in on the joke. bum fodder, or waste paper proper to wipe the nation's rump with, or your own. I enjoy the irony that this disposable bump, imagining its destiny down the privy, is one of my chosen 25 poems to chart the history of the nation. Of course, as a historian, it's no surprise to me that poetry can be interesting and important even when it's not necessarily good. But that has, unexpectedly, caused frequent surprise and discussion right from my very first conversations with Penguin through to events and interviews. And I do think actually that one of the barriers to poetry for many people is that it's somehow perceived as an arbiter of aesthetic taste and judgment. If you don't get it, that's your failing and you're on the outside. I think perhaps there's something gently liberating and empowering to be open and clear that not all poetry is timeless brilliance. Among that poetry, brilliant and not so brilliant, and the diverse voices I've included in my collection, I've noticed that much of the most radical writing is by women. Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved black African woman named after the ship which trafficked her, writing back from New England to a senior politician in England to advocate for freedom. She bases her authority on her own lived experience and her feeling heart. A direct line there again from emotion and empathy to ethical provocation and imperative. Anne Askew, who was willing to be burned for her radical, dissenting words of faith. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem, The Cry of the Children, which again is certainly not her best work, but it's a poem written to make a specific intervention at a moment in history which made a difference. Barrett Browning was moved to write by the Husker Pit disaster of 1838, in which 26 children were drowned in a coal mine near Barnsley, and I've put on the slide the names and the ages of the children who died, the youngest just 7, and one of the bits that I just always stays with me is that the age of one of the children, John Simpson, is given as 9.5, which for me just speaks so powerfully of a parent giving a child's age, or how a child would give their age. I find that very powerful. Barrett Browning was also responding to the Royal Commission on the Employment of Children and Very Young People in Mines and Factories, which reported its findings in 1842. She'd read this report in detail, and she's engaging with it throughout the poem, and in the original publication of the poem, in footnotes to the poem too. Those are stripped out of most editions today, which I think, really, maybe that speaks to our sense that poetry should be timeless and universal, but sometimes poetry is doing very engaged and specific work, and we lose that sense of it being in dialogue with another text and with its moment. Barrett Browning's depiction of weeping children who can't tell the difference between weeds and flowers, who don't know how to play, and who say that it is good when it happens that we die before our time, is very sentimental, even mawkish to us today. In fact, some early readers felt the discomfort of the middle-class Barrett Browning ventriloquizing the anguish of faceless, labouring children. Writing in the magazine Household Words, not long after The Cry of the Children was published, Henry Morley rejects the poetic sentimentality of Barrett Browning's poem and declares instead, "We mean here to speak prose." In particular, he contends with that line that the children feel it good and welcome that we die before our time. Instead, he spells out the realities of industrial deaths and maimings. He says, perhaps it is not good when a factory girl, who has not the whole spirit of play spun out of her for want of meadows, gambles upon bags of wool a little too near the exposed machinery that is to work it up, and is immediately seized and punished by the merciless machine that digs its shaft into her pinafore and hoists her up, tears out her left arm at the shoulder joint, breaks her right arm, and beats her on the head, he goes on. Why do we talk about such horrible things, he asks? Because they exist, and their existence should be clearly known. There are hints here of the risks and difficulties of using poetry as a historical source. Its crafty negotiations, evasions, and reimaginings of reality. But Barrett Browning knew her middle-class audience. Hers was an activist sentimentality, and her poem had an impact. It made things happen. Mary Leaper was a labouring class woman who worked in domestic service in the middle of the 18th century. Her poem, a kind of anti-country house poem, takes us below stairs in an English country house to see the human labour which underpins it. Mary Leaper was not wealthy, learned, or privileged. She received only a very elementary education, probably at her local free school in Brackley, Northamptonshire, and she entered domestic service during her adolescence, first at Weston Hall, near her childhood home, and then at Edgecote House, the model for Crumble Hall. Her master there, Richard Chauncey, later recalled that her fondness for writing verses displayed itself by her sometimes taking up her pen while the jack, the spit, was standing still and the meat scorching. So perhaps unsurprisingly, Leaper was dismissed from Edgecote House in 1745. Her poetry was not known beyond Northamptonshire in her lifetime. She died of measles in 1746 at the age of 24. Crumble Hall is brilliantly funny. As I say, it's an anti-country house poem, giving the lie to that genre's elegant fictions of the harmonious, productive country estate, which functions under a paternal, benevolent master without hard labour or effort. Leaper takes us into the kitchens to see the maid, Ursula, doing the washing up, while her love interest, the servant Roger, snores on the table after scoffing the leftovers. This is radical writing. Leaper turns the country house upside down, and she radically regenders the space too. We're not guided by a lord and master or a gentleman guest, but by Leaper herself, as she takes us through dusty attics and low passageways. Our focus is on the kitchen, the domain of the cook, and that puts us in the realm of women's agency. And when Leaper looks ahead with regret to imagine the programme of improvement of the gardens and grounds, which is just about to begin, she foresees the future landscape as a ravaged and barren green, words emphatically informed by female experience and pain. Some of you may know Anna Laetitia Barbauld's fearless reformist poem 1811, published in 1812. Barbauld is presenting a warning to politicians and thinkers in her own historical moment. Forever war with France, the rise of America and movement of power westwards across the Atlantic, disastrous government at home and the incapacity of George III, the spectre of looming decline and irrelevance. What's so remarkable and powerful about Barbauld's poem is that she writes a future history of the nation, an imagined England yet to be, in which youths from North America travel on their own future grand tour to visit the now crumbling cradle of their civilization. Barbauld's depiction of a ruined future England is as compelling, chilling, and alluring as any Gothic fantasy or present-day post-apocalyptic sci-fi. But the reviews were excoriating. Barbauld was effectively cancelled, told that she should have stuck to her hymns and her writing for children as good Mrs. Barbauld. This tattered first edition in Senate House Library is a reminder, I think, of the precarity and fragility of that vilified text's survival. there's misogyny bound up in this story, of course, as well as a reminder of how the most fearless, radical truth-telling can have dangerous consequences. My book takes us right up to the present. The final chapter starts with Zafar Kunial's wonderful poem, The Groundsman, from his collection England's Green, published in 2022. The poem imagines a small, cherished plot of land, pleasant, green, carefully bordered and tended. It's a cricket field, and Kunial is in character as the groundsman, now retired, speaking as he walks around its overgrown boundary in the full, heady verdure of summer. But this little bounded piece of earth isn't just a cricket field with its pristine pitch and clipped grass. Through Kunial's deliberate choice of words and imagery, it becomes England, a page in a book, a single day in the continuing run of history. It's a way into questions about how England is reckoning with its history today and what England might be in the future. Details in this overgrown summer hedgerow allude to moments in England's story. Often there's controversy or contention in these images, but Kunial doesn't interpret them or offer a moral position. He leaves us to decide. One in particular has had more resonance than I could have expected over these past few months: a flagpoled can. We could read this as a whimsical take on medieval pageantry or patriotic pride, a discarded drink can bobbing at the top of a stalk. Or is it about hooliganism and hate? I don't need to tell you how flags, and particularly the St. George Cross of England, have become a focal point for arguments about identity and sometimes racist demonstrations in recent months. I should say that my book is about England specifically because there's a clear and legible tradition in which poetry is involved in shaping ideas of England. Think, for instance, of that pastoral imaginary of the green and pleasant land. One chapter in my book begins with the St. George Cross, rippling in the breeze over a field in France. This is the chapter on the Battle of Agincourt, approached through the early 15th century Agincourt Carol, a jingoistic celebration of England's victory. But this flag is in glorious technicolor. The carol setting is by William Walton, and King Henry V is Laurence Olivier, because we're inside a scene from Olivier's 1944 film of the Shakespeare play. England's story is always about these layers of myth-making and memory, the use, reuse, and wresting of symbols for particular ends in specific historical moments. In September, I found myself on Times Radio talking to Hugo Rifkind about flags, history, and Englishness. Thinking about England has turned out to be more timely, not always for the right reasons, than I could have expected. And I think my book shows that England has repeatedly been at moments of crisis about its identity and its future for at least the past 1,000 years. But I hope it also shows that ideas of England are capacious and flexible, shaped and owned by diverse voices. Our history has always been complicated, colourful, contested. England is never just one thing. I spend time in the last chapter of my book engaging with our current context in which doing this work of history is itself so often under attack and yet never more important. Now, I mentioned at the start of this lecture that collaborative modes of production, co-creation, co-production, participatory research are fundamental to many visions and practices of radical history, including the Victoria County history. Commercial trade history isn't the most obvious place to try to do collaboration, and indeed, mine is a pretty conventional sole-authored book. But it was really important to me to embed collaboration into the book in a small way, to make visible, hopefully the acknowledgements make visible that it has been a collaborative process that's come out of conversations and networks and the expertise of many people. But I wanted to make it part of the book reaching forward as well. And there's a special section at the end of the book, which I had to argue quite hard for with my publisher. So there is a section of blank pages at the end of the book with an invitation for the reader to write in their own choice of poems. You would have chosen a different list of 25 poems and 25 different historical moments from me. What would they be? It is a small gesture, but it's grounded in values which are central to the book. I want the book to be open-ended, collaborative, invitational, the start of a conversation, not the end of a process. I don't want to set up a new locked canon or to claim to set out the definitive perspective on England and its history through poetry. I don't want the book to be hermetically authoritative. It's already been interesting to see responses. In the review for the FT Weekend paper, Nathan Brooker wrote, after the final chapter, Clarke writes, there's space for you to make this book your own by adding in your own choice of poems. F.R. Leavis, this ain't. Do you know, I love that. Because it's exactly right. Unlike F.R. Leavis, I'm not interested in locking in a great tradition or pronouncing on the quality and moral value of literature. I'd much rather crack open the canon and listen in to stories from the edge of history. And I've really enjoyed seeing the positive responses and readers' reviews online, as well as some examples of readers accepting the invitation and adding in their own choices and even creating their own poems in response. I'm doing some collaboration with the English Association, and I'm really excited to see what teachers and school pupils would choose to add to the book. I hope the book will exist in many different forms in future, that it'll have multiple lives and carry the imprint of other readers and writers, augmented and extended. And I'd like to think that in a very small way, there's something radical about writing this unfinishedness into a published book and explicitly making space for others' voices and interventions, for catalysing a conversation. And I think so much of my vision for this book has been shaped by the unique privilege of working here at the IHR. The IHR creates a unique, special space for encounter, engagement, and collaboration between historians of all kinds in our physical home here and in our online activities, networks, and diverse communities across the UK and beyond. That mission of the IHR, as you've heard, is embodied in the pages of our journal, Historical Research, and in the wonderful annual History Day we've enjoyed today, bringing together archives and collections from across the country. And how better to represent the experimental, boundary-pushing, and often radical work championed by the IHR than in the papers from our Pollard Prize winners celebrated this evening. And I really hope that readers will be able to see a clear line from the mission of the IHR to my book. So writing popular history, commercial non-fiction, can do radical, transformative, disruptive things to our own scholarly practice as historians too. I've spoken on other occasions about how writing this book enabled me to explore feeling and emotion in my research and in my responses to history in ways I think I'd always held at arm's length before. And I began this lecture by being very clear that popular history can be radical. So I want to conclude by setting out a manifesto for radical popular history, grounded in my own experience of writing a history of England in 25 poems, but also in a sense of the kind of radical history we need right now. I'm sure we'll all see aspects of our historical practice and our values reflected here. And again, I'm sure your manifesto, based on the work that you're doing, will look slightly different from mine. Radical history recovers, amplifies, and attends to voices and stories often previously marginalised within the archive and historical study. And there's a clear public market and appetite for this in popular, accessible history, not just the Tudors and the Nazis. I've noticed that particular chapters of my book repeatedly generate the most interest in reviews and when I do events and interviews. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's The Cry of the Children as a way into the collected testimony of those child workers in the 1842 Royal Commission report, and most of all, the poem written by Mary Leaper, that labouring class poet working in domestic service. Her words and her story, her own radical, witty, and subversive perspective are always a focus for attention. And I do want to make a brief aside as well. I've noticed that the very earliest period in my book, represented by my necklace today, from 8th century Northumbria through to the end of the 14th century, is the other focal point, which repeatedly generates the most public interest and discussion. How interesting, then, that it's precisely this period, the medieval, which is so often under particular pressure within the academy and always required to justify its value and relevance. Doing history has the power to move us to radical empathy, to enlarge our skills of imagination, to connect us compassionately with other lives, often in contexts wildly different from our own. Popular history, I think, has a particular role to play here, perhaps in its freer registers and modes, not so constrained by the conventions of academic writing, which allow us to surface and articulate stories of feeling in especially frank and compelling ways. Goodness knows that we need these skills of audacious empathy and imagination more than ever in our fractured and divided world today. Feeling should never be the end. For feeling and history to be radical, it has to point us towards response and action, not simply narrative, pleasure, the dubious enjoyment of catharsis. The responsibility of popular history is to draw a line, however gently, to ethical implications and obligations in our present. That's something I have tried to do throughout my book. I showed you one example from that chapter on Pearl, and I do hope that readers recognise that. Resistance to the machines. As some of you know, I've taken quite a bit of time recently to think and publish on generative AI to learn more about how it works and discover what it can do. ChatGPT can give you a history hitched together out of names and dates and factual gobbets, though these, of course, could just as well be hallucinated. But what it categorically can't do is this kind of history. It can't understand how people felt and feel. It has no authentic human emotional intelligence or authority. It has, to borrow the words of Phyllis Wheatley, no feeling heart. Practicing empathy through history and poetry is beyond anything AI can do. And because I believe that empathy is always at the centre of history and historical practice, this means that so-called AI can't really do history at all. It can't imagine. It can't bring a conscience to that kind of ethical line that could, should be drawn from history to action in the present. Finally, popular history creates new spaces for conversation, connection, participation, for community. Whether that's reading together, having a chat, sharing ideas, writing poems into a book, extending, augmenting, and continuing work together. Popular history might not always signpost it explicitly, but it can offer radical invitation and open-endedness. That's a really important statement about who has the right, the power to join the conversation and make history. It helps us further dismantle canons and rigid, exclusive scholarly traditions while demonstrating the value and importance of rigorous historical skills and training. Radical history can have usefully frayed edges and pose productively open questions. What other, more imaginative, more radical ways can we find to embody a collaborative, invitational spirit in commercial history publishing? I'd really love to hear your ideas, because history always is a work in progress. Thank you very much.